Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika Prananatha Pada Sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Kathamaham Payo Rasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhutanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Addanastrinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shiradhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktir ya nikilarta varga janani ya brahma sakshat krite Anandati shaya prada vishaya jat sukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam param bhaja yugam yasya mahanashrayo Ya karya vrajadokka vad gurutara premnaiva tasyai namah Yaram Yanikilartavar Yaram Yanikilagha Shanga Shamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yaram Yaswadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular, we're in the section on Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, and we're discussing the third element mentioned in this verse on the subject, that of vaiṣṇave jāti buddhiḥ, or the idea or considering a Vaishnava to belong to a caste. So, generally, it should be understood that by receiving Vaishnava Diksha, one transcends the caste of their birth. Yet, how, in the midst of that, is one nevertheless to see how Vaishnav culture and the Varnashram system coexist, and what will be the proper categorization and conduct towards persons who occupy different roles within that milieu. That's what we're drawing out from an extended discussion of relevant passages in the Bhagavatam and the commentaries on the Bhagavatam and various other places where our acharyas have analyzed this subject matter. So today we'll go further into that subject. Last time we finished off with discussion regarding how it is integral to the duty of a Vaiṣṇava to show respect to Brāhmaṇas, how Bhagavan is very pleased to see that Brāhmaṇas are honored. Bhagavan personally goes to great lengths to honor Brāhmaṇas, and that it is incumbent upon Vaiṣṇavas to also show respect to Brāhmaṇas, as well as the twice-born in general. So today, we'll look more specifically at this concept of twice-bornness, or quote, dvijata, and what it means, and who is eligible for it, and how it relates to Bhagavad-dharma. So I'm just picking up right where we left off in the commentary from last time. So this is just after the citation, the second citation of the Bhagavad 1086-53. So, still, to understand in further detail why Bhagavan Sri Krishna says here that a Brahmana is the best of all living beings by virtue of birth, reference can also be made to Srimad Bhagavatam 4.31.10, wherein there is a description of the sequence of 3 births that can occur in the lives of the 3 upper varnas, namely the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya varnas. Number 1, the seminal birth, what's called the Shokra birth, Shukra being a word for semen, so Shokra meaning seminal. The Savitra birth, which is something we'll explain in further detail later, and the sacrificial or Yajnika birth. Okay, so 3 types of birth. Number 1, the conventional type. Number 2, the Savitra birth. And number 3, the Yajnika birth. So what do these refer to? Let's find out. Sri Samipad, as well as Sri Jivapad, who cites Sri Samipad's commentary verbatim in Bhakti Sandarbha 51, and Sri Chakravartipad following him, explains in his commentary on the Bhagavad 4.31.10 that the seminal birth refers to a physical birth from a pure mother and father, meaning a mother and father who are from a sinless caste, that is, who are Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, or Vaishyas, and endowed with all the necessary sanskaras for their caste. So a seminal birth is, loosely speaking, a normal birth, but not just any normal birth, a birth into a family of persons of the 3 upper varnas who are part of families who have sustained all the traditional rites or sanskaras and duties, etc., that are enjoined to be upheld by the members of those varnas by the Shastras. So if someone is born into such a family where the culture is living, so to speak, and being practiced as it's designed, then that is considered to be a pure birth. So by pure, the implication is that one only is awarded such a birth if one has lived a sinless life or a highly pious life in the past. Now, second, the Savitra birth refers to a figurative birth. In other words, it's not it doesn't involve a literal womb and all of this, but rather it's a birth brought about by means of ritual or by means of the performance of a particular sanskar. So the Savitra birth refers to a figurative birth brought about by the Upanayana Samskara, meaning the birth brought about by receiving initiation into the Savitra mantra, that is, the Gayatri mantra, and being invested with the sacred thread, or Upavita. So to become a twice-born means to receive the Upanayana Samskar, in other words, to be taught the Brahma Gayatri mantra, and to receive the thread that is associated with meditation upon that mantra and other rites that the twice-born perform. Number 3, the sacrificial or Yajnika birth refers to another figurative birth brought about by Diksha, meaning specifically diksha into the performance of Vedic sacrifice. So the only critical bit here is that this third, quote, yagika birth is said to be the birth caused by diksha, but that diksha is not the Vaiṣṇava diksha of the path of Bhagavad-dharma or the path of bhakti. That's the diksha in which someone makes a commitment or performs the rite and makes the sankalpa to perform a particular yajna, such as in the case of Maharaj Nimi in the Bhagavatam, when he's performing this sacrifice and Vaṣṇava told him he would only come much later to complete it, but Nimi insisted on finishing it because he'd had this diksha or made this commitment to accomplish it at that time. So that's just a point of reference, and that will become clear as we further discuss the subject. So, birth into a family of Brāhmaṇas, Kshatriyas, or Vaishyas, receiving the Upanayan Sanskar, and then going through a rite of Diksha to perform a particular yajna. At that stage, someone will be called thrice born, or in other words, they will have had the birth into the proper Varna, they will have undergone the second birth of receiving the Upanayana, and then they will have undergone a third birth by taking up the performance of a particular yajna. So this is all terminology, this are all factors that pertain to the karma marg. This is not anything to do with the bhakti marg or Bhagavad Dharma at this stage in the discussion. This explanation of these three births can be affirmed by reference to Manusmriti and the Yajnavalkya Smriti. So just for saving time, I'll just read these translations. Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, these three Varnas become the twice-born, or Dvijas. The fourth, the Shudra Varna, is a caste, and there is no fifth Varna, meaning the Shudras are recognized as being part of this Varnashram system, but they're not considered eligible to become Dvijas. As per the precept of the Shruti, a twice-born's birth, first from a mother, that is a seminal birth, second by the tying of monji, that is the Upanayan Sanskar, which involves a ritual in which monji, a type of cane grass, is tied as a girdle around the initiate's waist. In other words, it's just figuratively referring to the Upanayan Sanskar by referring to the custom of using this particular grass that's done in the ceremony. And the third by Yajna Diksha, that is, initiation into performance of Vedic sacrifice. Then, in Yajnavalkya, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra are the Varnas. The first three, however, that is, but not the fourth, the Shudras, become twice-born. Since they are born from a mother, that is, by way of a seminal birth, and second by way of tying munji, these Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas are known as the twice-born. So, I understand, it sounds very simple, but it's just, I cite all of this just to define the terms very clearly, because later it starts to get complicated because we start using these terms figuratively, and so to understand their fundamental definitions makes the later complexity much easier to understand. Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself also summarizes this process in Srimad Bhagavatam. So, quote, after receiving in sequence the second birth, the Upanayan Sanskar, and being invited by a guru, a twice-born should dwell in the house of the guru, be disciplined, and study the Veda. So this is referring to the conventional Varnashram society. These are instructions Krishna is giving related to that, saying that a person at the, traditionally the Upanayan Sanskar is given between the ages of 8 and 16, depending on one's Varna. So that's the time that they undergo this Sanskar, and then after receiving the Sanskar, they go to the house of the Guru and they start their education. This is the traditional way. So Chakravarti Pad comments on this verse as follows: after receiving the first birth, the seminal birth, the second birth, the Savitra, that is the Upanayan Sanskar, meaning the birth known as the Upanayana, in sequence, that is, in accord with the proper order of samskaras beginning from the Garbhadhana, a twice-born, that is a member of the 3 upper Varnas, should study the Vedas, or Brahman. Is the term Brahman in the verse refers to the Veda here. Sri Narada, in the course of his affirmation explanation of the 4 Varnas to Yudhishthira Maharaj, also gives the following definition of a twice-born. So this is very important, and this verse gets discussed later and is crucial to understand in the right way. So this is the Bhagavatam's definition of a dvija, or a twice-born person. So it says, he in regard to whom the samskaras are uninterrupted, and whom the unborn one, namely Brahmadev, has mentioned, that is designated to be such, is a twice-born, or dvija. So 2 characteristics are required to be accepted as a twice-born. One has to have received the necessary samskars, and one has to be of designated eligibility for that, as per the statements of Brahma. So what does this refer to? Samipad comments as follows. Sri Narada states the definition of the twice-born. One in regard to whom the samskaras, that is those containing mantras beginning with the Garbhadhana, are uninterrupted. That is, one who has received all the necessary samskaras from ancestors, who have maintained all these necessary samskaras with uninterrupted generational continuity, is a twice-born. An objection is raised. Then if a Shudra has uninterrupted samskaras, he shall also possess twice-bornness. That is, so if a Shudra were to receive all the necessary samskaras from an ancestry that had maintained all of them with uninterrupted generational continuity, he too would be accepted as a twice-born. In other words, Samipad is showing why 2 characteristics are given to define a twice-born and not just 1. If the definition had only 1 characteristic, that you have to receive the samskaras from an ancestry that has maintained them, then you might think, well, anybody might just come along, join into the ceremony conducted by people who've performed it in an unbroken line of continuity, and then they also enter. So here Samipad is showing that the intent of the Bhagavatam is to say, no, Shudras are not eligible for that. So the second statement is made. In this regard, Sri Narada says, he who possessed of such samskaras whom the unborn one, Brahma, has mentioned to be a twice-born, is a twice-born. Brahma has not said that a Shudra can be possessed of samskaras containing mantras, and he, that is a Shudra, is not possessed of the Upanayana. Therefore, a Shudra is not a twice-born. Accordingly, the Smriti states the following, quote, even a Shudra should always attain the samskara of marriage alone. That is, a Shudra is not eligible for any samskara except that of marriage, and thus is not eligible for the Upanayana. The progenitor Brahma did not emanate him with any meter. In other words, when all these Varnas were said to come from the Purush, in the case of the first 3, he emanated them speaking a particular meter or metric verse of the Veda, but not in the case of the Shudras. So that's interpreted to mean that Shudras don't perform samskaras that contain mantras, and therefore they're not eligible for the Upanayana and other such things which use mantras. The Shruti also states the following, Brahma emanated the Brahmana with the Gayatri meter, the Kshatriya with the Trishtubha meter, the Vaishya with the Jagati meter, and the Shudra without any meter. Therefore the Shudra has no twice-bornness, or dvijata, because of the prohibition in every respect of the Upanayana samskar being conferred upon him, on account of any samskar other than marriage being unnecessary for a Shudra. This is the meaning. So, dry, standard, technical rules of Varnashram. This is what all these quotes are and the subject matter at hand. Sri Jiva in his commentary on this verse, follows Sri Samipad's conclusion in regard to the definition of a twice-born, and further clarifies the import of the second aspect of the definition. Quote, whom the unborn one, namely Brahma, emanated and mentioned to be a twice-born, that is designated as being a twice-born, means that only someone belonging to that caste shall be accepted as a twice-born when he has acquired the necessary samskaras. So this comment makes it known that practically speaking, to become a twice-born, one needs to have taken birth in a family of Brāhmaṇas, Kshatriyas, or Vaishyas, and then received the requisite samskaras. So, just broadly speaking, what are we doing here? We're showing that Jiva Gosvami, the Gaudiya Acharyas, follow, quote-unquote, the Varna Vyavastha, or that, they're not against this idea of, birth determining one's Varna and eligibility for various different rights and things being contingent upon such strata of birth. This is very much taught in the Bhagavatam with reference to the Smriti Shastra and upheld by the Acharyas who comment on these texts from our Sampradaya. Sri Chakravartipad also affirms this understanding in his commentary. Sri Narada states the definition of the twice-born, one in regard to whom the samskaras, that is, those containing mantras beginning with the garbhodhana, are uninterrupted, that is, one who has received all the necessary samskaras from ancestors who have maintained all those necessary samskaras with uninterrupted generational continuity, is a twice-born. Someone in regard to whom the samskaras are interrupted is, quote, a relative of a twice-born, or what's called a dvijabandhu. That is, he is not a twice-born. So suppose you're born in a Brahmin family, but you don't receive the Upanayan samskar. Then are you a twice-born? No, because you haven't undergone a second birth. But your family are considered twice-born because they have. So what are you? You're a dvijabandhu. You're the relative of people who are twice-born. You're not yet recognized as twice-born because you haven't received the second birth, so you're the relative of people who are. This is the meaning. Regarding the statement, whom the unborn one, that is Brahma, mentioned, the meaning is that specifically birth, given by a pure mother and father in a twice-born caste, manifested from the very beginning of the animation by Brahma, that is birth in a twice-born caste, that is a Brahmana, Kshatriya, or Vaishya family, from a mother and father who are pure, that is, who have also received all the necessary samskaras in an ancestry that has sustained uninterrupted generational continuity of these samskaras, is a primary characteristic of being a twice-born. It is noteworthy here that Sri Chakravartipad designates birth from a mother and father of a twice-born caste, that is, the Brahmana, Kshatriya, or Vaishya, as a, quote, primary characteristic or mukhya lakshana of being a twice-born. Thus, although Sri Samipad in his commentary on 3.11.35 described the characteristics observed in someone as the primary factor in the determination of their varna, along with consideration of the varna of their birth, implying as a secondary characteristic, here Sri Chakravartipad nevertheless describes birth in a family of Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, or Vaishyas as a primary characteristic of being a twice-born. This contrast further demonstrates that the intent of 7.11.35, so this was the verse we talked about previously, which is the one that everyone quotes to try to claim that your varna is just determined by qualities and birth doesn't matter. We discussed this already. We showed the commentaries where the acharyas say the intent of the verse in saying that the varna is designated by qualities is to say that it's designated not only by birth, but by birth and qualities. So although the verse literally says that, the commentaries on that verse specifically say that, yes, that is relevant and birth is also relevant. And now you have here in a statement from where just right before that, in other words, this verse that we're talking about now is just 20 verses earlier in the text. So if you're studying the Bhagavatam in context, you're not even going to read that statement before you've read these statements here, where Chakravarti Pad is saying that birth is a primary characteristic of your Varna. So that you would read the Acharyas saying birth is a primary characteristic in determining your Varna, and then a few verses later where it says, and Varna is determined by qualities, that you would just like erase and ignore these statements that are made earlier and not see that they are complementary and that the points are simply saying that both are part of the consideration, is really an unfair reading of the passage. And it's what you call cherry picking, or, pulling something out of context to try to promote a theory, which isn't really, can be demonstrated from the context in which it is said in the Acharya's comments on that chapter to not be not be the way that they see the text conveying its meaning. This contrast further demonstrates that the intent of the Bhagavad 7.11.35 is not to provide a practical guideline for the codes of conduct to be assigned or observed by individuals, but rather a guideline for how meritorious characteristics in individuals are to be respected. And as we go through this whole analysis, this is a big theme that is, a repeated thing, is there's consideration of Varna in terms of the actual rules of how people should act, and then there's consideration of Varna in terms of how people should be respected. So when statements of equivalence are made, are they made in equivalence saying this person, quote, is a Brahmana? Does that mean that they're literally a Brahmana, should act like Brahmanas and not like non-Brahmanas? Or does it mean that they should be respected the way a Brahmana is respected, or recognized to have Brahminical qualities? In many cases, it's the second. So that is something to bear in mind as these statements are made, and as we'll see the Acharya's comment to that effect here and also later on. So the aforecited commentaries on 7.11.13 also further affirm in accord with the aforecited statements from the Smriti Shastras that Shudras and those born in other jātis apart from the upper three Varnas are intrinsically devoid of eligibility to become a twice-born. And as such, they are also devoid of eligibility to receive the third birth, the Yajnika birth, aforementioned in 431.10. In other words, if you're not a twice-born, you can't become a thrice-born. You need to be second before you can be third. It can thus be understood from all the aforecited statements in Srimad Bhagavatam and other texts on this subject that birth is a determining factor in the designation of a person's Varna, and that respect is to be shown to individuals commensurately in accord with all their respective characteristics, namely their qualities, conduct, and so forth, as well as their birth. A statement of Yajnavalkya Rishi cited by Sri Jiva in his commentary on 10.16.2 further affirms these conclusions. So this is a key reference. Janmana brahmano gyeya sangskarayar dvija uchyate vidyaya yati vipratam tribi shrotriya lakshanam. One is to be known as a brahmana by birth. One is called a twice-born by samskaras. One attains vipratva, or the status of being a vipra, meaning a learned person, by learning. The characteristic of a shrotriya, that is one who is conversant in the Veda, is by these three. That is, one who is born in a Brahmana family, receives the necessary samskaras, and attains the necessary learning, is to be accepted and respected as being shrotriya, or conversant in the Vedas. Okay? So, unless you've heard contrary opinions, this is very easy to understand and very straightforward. You're a Brahmana by birth. You become twice-born when you get the Upanayana, and you become a Vipra when you study the Veda. And someone who has the birth, who has the ritual purification, and who has the education, collectively is called Shrotriya, meaning conversant or learned. And, more broadly, you can say it just means a cultured person. Who is a cultured person? Someone who's born into a cultured family, who receives the ritual and the upbringing surrounded to that and becomes well-educated, they're cultured. So it doesn't need to be unnecessarily complicated, and sometimes, the technicalities of the terminology can make it seem a little fuzzy or unclear for those of us who aren't culturally embedded in this type of context. But essentially, this is a statement from the Smriti Shastra. Jiva Gosvami himself is quoting this in the Laghu Vaishnav Toshani, and he's saying that what does it mean to be a cultured Brahmana? This is what it means. You're born here, you're raised like this, and you're educated. So, the complexity is that in the name of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, floated around is the following verse. Confusion still arises in this regard, however, because of a popular Sanskrit statement that seems to say the opposite. Janmana jayate shudra, sangskarad bhaved dvija, vedapatad bhaved vipro, brahma janati brahmana. One becomes a Shudra by birth. One can become a twice born by samskaras. One can become a Vipra by recitation of the Veda. One is a Brahmana when one knows Brahman. So this is something that everybody who wants to speak against the idea of the designation of caste or Varna by birth quotes. One becomes a Shudra by birth, and you'll find other statements. Everyone's a Shudra by birth. No one's anything by birth, in other words. But when you receive the samskaras, when you receive the ritual purification, then you become a twice born. When you learn to recite the Veda, you're recognized as learned. And being a, quote, Brahmana isn't by birth, it's because you know Brahman. And etymologically, that's the fact. The word Brahmana is derived from the word Brahman. So one who knows Brahman is a Brahmana. And then Advaita Vedantis or, modern New Age thinkers, they'll say, and Brahman means spirituality. Brahman means, divine truth. So really Brahmanas just means anyone who has spiritual knowledge. And then they just whick, like the entire culture just goes like off the window. So I've given some analysis here of this statement, and first of all, notice I'm not citing a source for this statement. Why? Because there is no source. It should be observed, however, that this statement cannot be traced back to any authentic Shastra, and its final quarter breaks the meter in which it is composed. So anyone who's educated, these are the first two things they look at. Is the thing actually a proper sentence, and where does it come from? And it fails both of these tests. It's not even a properly composed statement. It's not even fitting the Anushtup meter, which is the simplest Sanskrit meter there is. And you can't find it in any text. So, It is thus of dubious origin and unfit to be regarded as authoritative by those who follow the teachings of acharyas like Sridhar Samipad, Jiva Gosvami-pad, and Vishwanath Chakravarti-pad. So if you're a follower of these acharyas, and you're aware that Jiva Goswami has just quoted this previous statement of Yajnavalkya, and then you see this statement, are you going to quote that? Or are you going to be like, oh yeah, here we go? Right? How could you? Right? It directly contradicts the statement on the exact same subject that Jiva Goswami quotes. It's improperly composed and it has no source. So that we're gonna, stake our whole viewpoint on something, spurious like this, at least in my opinion, would not be wise. But I've got some further analysis. So now, to be charitable, or to, say, well, let's still consider the content of the verse. Let's not just rule it out based on source and spelling. If we want to, be charitable and entertain the ideas nonetheless, then we'll get the following. Be that as it may, the first half of the questionable verse does match exactly a statement in Skanda Puran. There thus arises an apparent contradiction between the statement and the aforesaid statement of Yajnavalkya cited by Sri Jivapad. One is to be known as a Brahmana by birth, one is called a twice born by samskaras. As well as in regard to the other aforesaid statements from Srimad Bhagavatam, that state that one becomes a Brahmana or a member of other Varnas by birth, and that only the members of the 3 upper Varnas are eligible to become a twice-born by receiving the necessary samskaras. Since the statement in Skanda Puran, one becomes a Shudra by birth, one can become a twice-born by samskaras, which implies that all human beings are born Shudras, and that Shudras can become twice-borns. So, this statement seems to contradict all these other statements we've already discussed in the Bhagavatam and that are cited by the commentators. So how to resolve this contradiction? If we want to entertain this statement, at least entertain the first half of the statement, because that same phrase can be found in the Skanda Puran. So why does the Skanda Puran say this if the Bhagavatam and these other Smritis say the opposite? This apparent contradiction can be resolved by understanding the intent of the verse in the Skanda Puran and interpreting its meaning accordingly. To understand its intent, one should observe that the Skanda Puran itself also propounds the view that a person is designated a Brahmana by birth, and that respect is to be shown to a Brahmana because of his birth, but more so because of his study of the Vedas. Quote, Brahmanas are worthy of respect by birth, and more so by study of the Veda. Okay, so the Skanda Puran over here says one is born a Shudra one becomes a Shudra by birth, and over here it's saying a Brahmana is worthy of respect because of their birth. So the Skanda Puran isn't trying to say that birth is not a distinguishing characteristic in the case of the assignment of a Varna. In this statement, one is born a Shudra, because elsewhere it's saying that birth is a characteristic. So why is the Skanda Puran seeming to contradict itself? Thus, when the Skanda Puran says, quote, one becomes a Shudra by birth, one can become a twice-born by samskaras, the statement is not meant to be taken literally, and rather is to be taken figuratively. Everyone, including those born in Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya families, is quote-unquote born a Shudra, in the sense that everyone is Shudravat, or Shudra-like, in the limited sense that by birth alone, they are not eligible to engage in the activities of the twice-born. The import of the statement is simply that those born in Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya families need to receive the necessary samskaras, which they are eligible for by virtue of their seminal birth, to become a twice-born, and only then can they engage in the activities of the twice-born, namely study of the Veda, performance of yajna, and so on. When this statement from Skanda Puran is understood figuratively in this way, it can be seen that the statement does not actually contradict any of the aforecited statements that affirm birth as a determining factor in regard to one's Varna, and that the statement's primary intent is to stress the importance of those who have the necessary eligibility by birth going through the process of receiving the requisite samskaras to become a twice-born. So essentially, it's a statement made to the people born in Brahmin families or other upper caste families, and saying that until you complete your Upanayan Samskar, you're not really better than a Shudra, or you're not really imbued with the eligibility that lets you study the Veda until you complete this Samskara. So you need to do that, and then you can start your education. That's the whole point. So, to go from a statement which is just encouraging people born in these families to go through the samskara to, no, we're going to chuck out the whole consideration of birth and say anyone and everyone can perform these samskaras and then engage in the activities that those with the samskaras have, based on this statement, will go way off, out of field, so to speak, from the context of what it's trying to say. But if we understand it like this, then there's no contradiction at all with all the points made in the Bhagavatam and the other Smriti Shastras. So now you might say, okay, well that's only half of this spurious statement, that we were quoting before. There's still this point about that you're a, quote, Brahmana because you know Brahman. So what to do with that? In the second half of the aforecited verse of untraceable origin, It is said that one can become a Vipra by recitation of the Veda, and that one is a Brahmana when one knows Brahman. The first of these 2 points is also stated in the aforecited statement of Yajnavalkya Rishi cited by Jiva and is of clear import. In other words, those 2 things are equivalent, there's no issue. The final point, that one is a Brahmana when one knows Brahman, alludes to an etymological derivation of the word Brahmana, to this effect. And its statement in this verse indicates an intent to imply that one cannot become a Brahmana by birth, but rather only by means of knowledge of Brahman. Explanation of the term Brahmana as being referent to a knower of Brahman, that is, of the unqualified feature of the Paratattva, can be found, for example, in the work of Shankaracharya. Sri Chakravarti Pad, alternately, gives the following etymological derivation of the word Brahmana, which is based on interpreting the word Brahman to refer to the Veda rather than the unqualified feature of the Paratattva, in his commentary on the aforecited teaching of Sri Narada in Srimad Bhagavatam 7.14.41, stating that a Brahmana is most respectable among all human beings. So, what does the etymological basis, or how does Chakravarti Pad interpret the etymological meaning of the word Brahmana? He reads it like this: one who by means of knowledge carries the Veda, the referent of the word Brahman is called a Brahmana. In this way, by this, meaning according to this sutra in the Ashtadhyayi, the derivation of the word Brahmana is shown. So if we want to follow the Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, how should we etymologically interpret the word Brahman? Well, we should interpret it the way they interpret it. And how did they interpret it? They interpret it not to refer to Brahman in the ontological sense, but Brahman as a synonym for Veda. So who is a Brahmana? It's someone who knows the Vedas. It's someone who studied the Vedas, someone who, quote, carries the Vedas or is of the Vedas. Nothing complicated or unusual about that. To try to construe this idea of a Brahmana as a spiritual concept or related only to something of transcendence isn't necessary, so to speak. In other words, it's a statement made relative to the karma marg, relative to the roles and, social order within the worldly context, and it has its function in that space. So Brahmana means the people who are expert, the people whose job is to sustain the culture of the Veda in society. That's what a Brahmana means. It means one who carries Brahman, the Veda. So someone might also see value in interpreting it in another way, that the Veda ultimately teaches Brahman. So in, Nirvishesh Brahman or the Paratattva, so a Brahmana ultimately is someone who knows that because that's the ultimate import of the Veda. Okay, in other words, if Shankaracharya wants to go in that direction with it, no objection. That's understandable, or that's admissible. But if then on the, admissibility of this secondary sense, one then wants to reinterpret the whole culture based on that and, do away with all these injunctions that are stated in the scriptures themselves, then it becomes problematic. So anyway, what I'm basically just demonstrating is that this verse that has no trace and is misspelled, conveys this etymological meaning of the word Brahman, which isn't even the way that any of our acharyas would interpret it, or have interpreted the word. So to try to use this verse as a way of representing the opinion of the Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, to me, is quite problematic because it's posing direct contradictions to the Bhagavatam itself, to the works of earlier commentators, and the exact concept of what is stated in there contradicts a point made by one of the acharyas. So to use a verse of no tangible origin that has an error in it in lieu of all this other conceptually consistent body of teaching, to me, just it's not satisfying. Okay. So where was I? All right. When it is in this way understood that eligibility to become a twice-born, to study the Veda, and to receive the third yagika birth, that is diksha into the performance of Vedic sacrifice, yajna, and to thus actually perform any such yajna, is reserved only for those who are born into a Brāhmana, Kshatriya, or Vaishya varna, that is, castes, meaning any of those castes. The stark contrast between the standard of eligibility that pertains to the path of karma and the standard of eligibility for the path of bhakti can be aptly recognized. Okay, so now we're going to come into, more mainline Gaudiya Vaishnava discourse, so to speak. In other words, how does any of that relate to the path of bhakti? Or what are the differences between all of that and the path of bhakti? And when the path of bhakti and the eligibility for it is introduced, what is it, where and when is that path and eligibility being introduced? It's being introduced into a society that functions according to the aforementioned rules. So when Rupa Goswami is trying to teach what is the eligibility for bhakti, his audience is people who think the way we just explained about the varnas, about birth, about the Veda, about the Upanayan Samskar, etc. This is the cultural context and notion of eligibility for the path of karma that pervades the society to which Rupa Goswami is speaking. So he wants to speak to a society of people who are following that path, who are steeped in those customs, and explain how the path of bhakti is something different than the path of karma and has a different criteria of eligibility. So if we look at the way Rupa Goswami explains the path of eligibility for the path of bhakti with this background context, we can get a further insight into why he's saying what he's saying. So hopefully that will be evident when we go through this. So Sri Rupa summarizes the verdict of the Shastras in regard to the eligibility for the path of bhakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. After describing presenting a detailed analysis, which in essence states that someone who is endowed with Shraddha in Uttama Bhakti and free from desire for worldly enjoyment and mukti is a bearer of eligibility for the path of pure bhakti. That's something we discussed at great length in the earlier classes on the Chaitanya Charitamrita, so we're not going to dive into all of that. Sri Rupa considers that readers of his treatise may also wonder whether or not someone needs to be a member of the three upper varnas to be eligible for diksha into and practice of the path of Uttama Bhakti, as one needs to be in order to become a twice-born and perform a twice-born's rites on the path of karma, that is, to receive yagika diksha and perform yajna. Thus, he concludes his discussion of the subject of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti by clarifying that all human beings, irrespective of their caste, can be bearers of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti. The eligibility of every human being for bhakti is heard of in the Shastra. Since bhakti to Hari was adduced as an example by Vasishta while speaking to a king of the eligibility of all for bathing during the month of Magh, as is stated in the Padma Puran, quote, indeed, everyone is a bearer of eligibility in this case, that is in the case of bathing during the month of Magh, as in the case of bhakti to Hari, O king. So this is, it requires a little bit of understanding of hermeneutics. So you have what's called the upaman and the upameya, or the object of comparison and the subject of comparison. So there's a subject that you're talking about, and then an object to which you're comparing it. Like, her face is as beautiful as the moon. So, quote, her face is the subject of comparison, and the moon is the object of comparison. So if you want to convey that someone's face is beautiful, what do you compare it to? Beautiful things. And not just any beautiful things, but like very beautiful things, or something that's the epitome of beauty. So Krishna's feet are lotus feet, and his face is a moon face, because the object of comparison that's chosen is something that is meant to be understood by the audience as having the characteristic that you want to convey to that audience is strongly present in the subject that you're speaking to them about. So by using anything as an object of comparison, you're implying that there's a well-known prominent characteristic in this object which is known to the audience that you speak to. So when Rupa Goswami is quoting this verse from the Padma Puran, he's pointing out that the path of bhakti is being used as an object of comparison for this idea of universal eligibility. So the idea is there's a promotion of the Magh Mahatmya or Magh Snan, what they call the Kumbh Mela, and everyone going to bathe in the month of Magh. This is highly praised as having so many different benefits for worldly interests or whatever. And so how to convey that this wonderfully beneficial thing called bathing in the month of Magh is available to everyone? Well, it's like bhakti. In other words, everybody knows that anybody can do bhakti, so bathing in the Ganga in the month of Magh, it's like that. So by using that comparison, the implication is that bhakti is something available to everyone. So anyway, he's using this citation to make his point, and that's the background reasoning behind it. And secondly, and so on, stated in the Kashi Khanda of the Mahabharata, quote, even outcasts in the king of Kashi's region, bearing the marks of the conch and chakra, receive Vaiṣṇavi Diksha. That is the Diksha accepted by Vaiṣṇavas, which is also known as Vaiṣṇava Diksha, Viṣṇu Diksha, and Bhagavad Diksha, and shine like the Dikshita, that is like the twice-born who have received a third birth of Yajnika Diksha, and are engaged in performance of Vedic sacrifice. So this is also a little bit tricky. So he's saying that he's comparing someone who gets, Rupa Goswami is quoting this statement of the Mahabharata, which is comparing someone who receives Vaiṣṇava Diksha to someone who has Yajnika Diksha. So what's first of all noticeable is that those are two different things. You don't compare two things that are the same. So the comparison indicates that they're two different things. So just as someone who in this society is, an upper class, born in an upper class, received the Upanayana, went through their education, committed themselves to a yajna, received this yajnik diksha, and is, so to speak, shining. In other words, they are, engaged in high culture, using, or realizing the full potential of their birth and education and human capacities to perform this pious act, that this is like in effect, a human being shining, if you will, that someone who receives diksha to the path of bhakti and engages in all their human faculties in bhakti to Bhagavan, they also shine like that. This is the idea. So what's just notable about it is that Bhagavad Diksha is compared to Yajnik Diksha. So this is something that's going to come up later, because sometimes these two things, people want to conflate them, or they end up getting conflated as being the same thing, but they're two completely distinct things, but are comparable in that a person shines when they perform them, so to speak. Okay, Srimad Mahaprabhu states the same conclusion in a frank manner in one of his teachings to Sri Sanatana Pad. Quote, a person of low caste is not unqualified for worship of Krishna, and a Brahmin of noble family is not qualified for worship of Krishna just because of his birth samskars, twice-born status, performance of yajna, and so on. One who worships Krishna is great, a non-bhakta is lowly and insignificant. There is no consideration of caste, family, and so on in regard to worship of Krishna. So the adhikar for bhakti is different than the adhikar for twice-bornness and yajna. very different. In one, caste, Upanaya and Sanskar are necessary. In the other, they're completely not necessary. So these 2 points are emphasized clearly by Rupa Goswami and by Mahaprabhu. Sri Jiva Pad and Sri Chakravarti Pad following him also note in this regard that Sri Narada giving the young boy Dhruva, who had not become a twice-born, the mantra Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, and teaching him how to practice bhakti to Bhagavan, is also an instance of evidence in Srimad Bhagavatam itself that being a twice-born and the various requisites of eligibility in regard to the path of karma are not part of eligibility for the path of Uttama Bhakti. In other words, Dhruva is just a 5-year-old boy, he doesn't have the Upanayana, but Narada gives him Vaiṣṇava Diksha and teaches him Bhakti. So do you need to have Upanayana or do Yajna to become a Bhakta? Obviously not. Sri Sanatana Pad similarly cites a verse in Hari Bhakti Vilas that affirms that no samskaras, such as the Garbhadhana or Upanayana, are required for someone to become eligible to receive the Gopal mantra, which is the principal mantra used for worship of Bhagavan Sri Krishna taught in the Vaishnava Tantra Shastra, and the principal mantra used in the manner of worship taught by the Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, Sri Rupa Pad, Sri Sanatana Pad, and Sri Jiva Pad. Quote, the divine Gopal mantra does not depend on anything, that is, any samskara such as the Upanayana or any other means of purification, preparation, etc. Upon touching just the heart, it certainly produces results, just as a fire does upon being touched. So fire will burn you whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, or what have you. Like that, this mantra will purify you, whether you're a twice born or you're not, or whatever your birth is, or whatever your education may be, or what have you. This mantra will have a purifying effect. This is the point being made. So, when in this way the status of being a member of the 3 upper varnas, that is the status of being a twice-born, and the status of being thrice-born, are understood to be unnecessary and distinct from eligibility for the path of bhakti, one may wonder why then bhakti to Bhagavan was listed among the characteristics of the upper varnas in the aforementioned enumerations thereof taught by Sri Narada and Sri Krishna, and why members of these varnas who are endowed with all the characteristics of their varna are not then recognized as bhaktas of Bhagavan, that is, as Vaiṣṇavas. Okay, sorry, one sec. I was going to try to shift who is the host, but I don't know if I know how to do that. Oh dear. Okay, I put up another link. Okay, sorry about that. I tried to avoid that, but I didn't quite make it. Anyway, I can stop here for now. So where we're up to now is that we've demonstrated what is the adhikar for the path of bhakti, what is the adhikar for the path of karma, or what is the adhikar for the upanaya and samskar, for dvijata, for the performance of yajna. And then we come to, an understanding that the eligibility for these 2 things is separate, and that you don't need any of these things of the karma marg to be eligible or to engage in the path of bhakti. Then, the complex part then, is that earlier when it was listing the qualities of these varnas, then some of the qualities mentioned were that these Brahmanas or these other Varnas have bhakti. So if these Varnas, or if one of the characteristics of being a part of these Varnas is having bhakti, then why are we even calling these people Brahmanas and not just calling them Vaiṣṇavas? How is it that part of being a Brahmana is having bhakti, and yet being a bhakta doesn't have anything to do with being a Brahmana, or that you can be a Brahmana without being a bhakta? How does, that you can be a bhakta without being a Brahmana? How do these two things fit together, and why does the Bhagavatam include bhakti as if being a characteristic of Brahmanatva? So that's what we'll discuss next. So I conclude here for today. And again, these are technical, categorical rules, essentially, about, Varnashram society. But, we're digging into them, and there has been, there is differences of opinion out there. There is sometimes argument about how these things are meant to be applied. So this is my, meager attempt to show how the acharyas have actually dealt with these subject matters, and therefore if we wish to follow the viewpoints of those, you could say, the early core of the Gaudiya Vaishnava scriptural commentators, then what attitude, what principles will we understand? Then I hope that this sheds some clarification on that, or at least is perceived as a worthwhile purva-paksha if someone doesn't agree with it. So if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or anything otherwise, please feel free to share. All right, well, we can leave it at that, and in our next session, we'll go further. As I said, this is long and this is technical. So we'll look at, why Brahmanas are said to have bhakti, but yet why bhaktas are said to have something that Brahmanas don't have, and more the overlap, if you will, or the likeness and the distinction between Vaishnavas and Brahmanas will tease out more of the contours of that as we go further. So I conclude here. Vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.